Hello everybody, I am Jarrett Ross, the Genie Vlogger, and welcome back to another Professional Genealogist Reacts. On today's video, I will be reacting to why Ancestry DNA tests don't work how you think they do by the Welsh Viking. Now this is a channel that I'm not super familiar with, but I had a lot of people who suggested this video to me after it came out a little over a month or two ago, and I watched it then, and I was like, yeah, I think I do want to do a reaction video to this, but I kind of had some other ones I wanted to do first, and so I just put this off a little bit. So even though I saw it like a month or two ago, I haven't seen it since then, so it'll be somewhat fresh for me, but I think I'll have a lot to say about what he's got to say, so let's jump into it.
So we're going to start this off by saying this is an incredibly complicated and nuanced subject. I have a background in archaeology and archaeological studies, but my focus has always been material culture related. I study gravestones, I study buildings, I study that sort of thing. I study shards of pottery that people dig out of the earth. But every now and then, DNA starts to be a part of what I'm looking at, and I have looked at DNA in school. 10 years ago I did A-level biology, and that involved learning about Gregor Mendel and his peas and the very start of us identifying DNA and the building blocks of life, if you like. After that I did a little bit of how DNA analysis works archaeologically at university, but throughout all of that, the thing that struck me was DNA analysis is ridiculously complicated. And
now what's interesting is that image he just shows, which actually I'm gonna try to find that again. There we go. That image that he shows, this is not something that a lot of people will technically see. This is a, I think it was a peak chart is what it's called, but you can kind of see how it's got these ups and downs. And now I've never seen a peak chart like this where it's showing each spot of the DNA. Usually I've seen peak charts when they're doing a specific type of DNA testing called STR testing, short tandem repeat, as opposed to SNP testing, or specifically autosomal SNP testing, which is what we do for the genealogy DNA test, or the consumer test that most people take, Ancestry, 23andMe, etc. The stuff that gives you the percentages of what your ancestry is. This looks like this is a peak chart for SNP testing, because SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms, and it's kind of just a fancy word for a specific spot in your genome where, you know, you have an AA or a GG or a CG or whatever, but at that spot there is an expected variation for some people, and so because of that variation, that polymorphism, then if we see that there, that helps us connect them to diseases or populations or to other people, and that's kind of what gets into the nitty-gritty of certain things.
in recent years, human genomics have made massive leaps. We have structured the human genome. We have the human genome, it's been mapped. We have a map of what makes us, right? DNA and RNA sequencing has rocketed in the late 20th century and early 21st century to the point where we can now offer what you might call consumer genomics, where you can send a sample of your spit to a company based in a mysterious laboratory somewhere, and they will take that sample of your spit and they will tell you what your genetic makeup looks like, what your DNA looks like.
Now, it's funny that he said some unknown lab or random lab, because there are some companies where you don't quite know where their lab is testing, especially if you do some of the tests that are outside of the typical ones you hear about. So like whole genome sequencing is popular for people that want to get your entire genome sequenced, whereas these direct-to-consumer tests like Ancestry and 23andMe are only part of it, part of the whole genome, that is. So with a Ancestry test or 23andMe, they're only testing about 700,000 spots of your DNA. So those SNPs we were talking about, single nucleotide polymorphism. But SNPs are only specific spots in the genome where we're expecting differences and variations. Your entire genome is billions of different base pairs. So I think it's like 3 or 4 billion, I don't remember exactly how much, but with 3 or 4 billion different spots on your DNA, and we're only looking at about 700,000 for these typical consumer tests, well, that's only one portion of your entire genome. So whole genome sequence tests are testing all of it. And that's not just your autosomal DNA. So remember before I said autosomal SNP testing and autosomal STR testing. Well, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, chromosome 1 to 22, those are your autosomes. The 23rd pair are your sex chromosomes. So that's the X chromosome and the Y chromosome. And then the third type of DNA we test is mitochondrial DNA. So the other types of DNA, that 23 pairs of chromosomes, that's what you're going to find in your cell's nucleus and all of that. That's your DNA. But in your cells, you have mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. And the mitochondrial DNA is completely different. But we can use mitochondrial DNA as well. So that's your purely maternal line, going up your mother's line, because the mitochondrial DNA you inherit is coming from your mother. So when you do a whole genome sequence test, it's testing all of that. But the reason I mention this is because of that whole labs comment, where some of these companies are using third-party labs that are located in China or in Asia or elsewhere, or sometimes they don't tell you. But for a lot of direct-to-consumer tests, like, they will tell you where the labs are. So like 23andMe, they have like a really well-known lab that they've actually had influencers and content creators come and interview them. And I remember Veritasium went to one of the labs as well. I want to say he went to 23andMe, but he might have gone to another one. So not all of the labs are in some like random place that, you know, this mysterious lab.
And I'm using the term Ancestry DNA here, not specifically referring to Ancestry.com. Rather, I am using it to refer to DNA that claims to allow you to trace your ancestry. Cool. There are many companies that do this, and they basically do the same thing. They take a sample of your DNA, usually a spit sample in a tube,
or a swab sample. Not all of them are spit samples. The two that are spit samples are Ancestry and 23andMe. But if you do MyHeritage or Family Tree DNA, you're going to get two swabs that you're going to do in the inside of your cheek. It's buccal or buccal swabs. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I don't know if there's a specific actual way to say it. If you have a comment about that, put that down below, because when it comes to pronouncing certain things, certain people get really mad about it. But either way, it's the swabs that you do in your mouth, so it's not always going to be the spit tube.
And they use an array of machines, one of which is actually called an array, and they basically will tell you if you have genes that are likely to cause genetic diseases. Alzheimer's disease is one of the things that people often get tested to see if they have the Alzheimer's genes.
So these microarray machines he's referring to often are called SNP microarrays. Remember that term SNP, single nucleotide polymorphism. Well, that's what we use to tell these connections to different diseases. So if they're studying a disease and trying to figure out what's the common SNP that these people that have this disease have, well, we keep finding that they have this SNP variation and this SNP variation and this one, etc. And by using that, then when they look at your DNA, if you have those variations, you're either going to be at a higher risk, or maybe you don't have the variations and so you're at a lower risk. Now, if you do a direct-to-consumer test and you get it where it's saying you're at a higher risk for something, it doesn't mean you're going to get it necessarily. And at the same time, if you get a result back saying you have no variation showing a risk for this disease, so you're at a lower risk, it doesn't mean you're not going to get it. So you need to take things further if you really want to understand the medical side of this.
People also do it to figure out where their ancestors are from, and this is very, very popular in places like North America with people who are effectively descended from migrants, however those migrants got to North America, because many North Americans don't feel that they have a right to call themselves of the land that they live in, and want to figure out where the heck their DNA comes from. The problem with Ancestry DNA testing is it doesn't work.
Hey gang, editing Jimmy here. You can tell because I'm casually dressed and filming this on a phone. So, I don't mention here a bit of a nuance I've forgotten. I make a blanket statement, which is a naughty thing for Jimmy to do. The Ancestry DNA tests do not work as a way to see if you are genetically related to somebody in your deep past. They cannot tell you that you are genetically related to somebody 1,000 years ago unless a specific test is done using ancient DNA, which is what we call DNA samples taken from archaeological specimens.
And with that, you also need to do a specific type of testing, either Y chromosome testing or mitochondrial DNA testing, because those are the two types of testing where you can compare to ancient samples and find out how related you are. Now, you can use your autosomal DNA to look at the comparison, but it's not going to really give you an idea of how related you truly are to those people. But with a Y chromosome test, which traces your purely paternal line, because men receive a Y chromosome from their father, which is largely unchanged, and that came from their father, and so on, tracing all the way back to what we call Y chromosomal Adam. Then with mitochondrial DNA, it's kind of the same thing, except tracing up the maternal line. So your mother's mother's mother tracing up to mitochondrial Eve. Now, Y chromosomal Adam and mitochondrial Eve did not live at the same time, and a lot of people hate the use of the Adam and Eve monikers to equate that, because a lot of people hear it and think the religious context, but really it's kind of just used in the context of like, well, Adam and Eve were the first humans in a sense, and so everyone in the world descends from Y chromosomal Adam, and if we trace every single known Y chromosome back, Y chromosomal Adam is the most recent human where all of our Y chromosomes descend from. And mitochondrial Eve is the same thing, but there were other people alive at that same time, and there were people that lived before them as well. It's just that there are certain Y chromosomes and mitochondrial lineages that would have died out. So a lot of what he's saying here is correct, but it also, kind of like he said in the beginning, it's so nuanced that he's kind of actually missing some pieces with it, and I understand, because he's coming from a different mindset. He's coming from an archaeological mindset and an ancient DNA mindset, which is what his channel's based on. It's looking at more ancient sort of history than what I focus on in genealogy, which we're looking at like the past 200, 300 years most of the time, sometimes a little bit further, but usually that genealogical time window is kind of like 1600s and closer, but often 1700s and closer, especially when we're talking DNA.
It does work if, for example, you are trying to find your long-lost brother or sister or mum or dad. That can be very, very good, as I say later in the video. One of the other reasons it's often used in places like the Caribbean, North America, Africa, you're guessing where this is going from, is to figure out where enslaved people came from. So there are programs happening right now, and I'm linking to it in the description, that use archaeological DNA and DNA samples from the skeletons of enslaved people to figure out where they came from, and to try and reconcile them in a way with their origins, maybe to repatriate their bones, and just to get a fuller picture of these people whose lives were cut short, who lived through great pain, and who basically died unknown. So amazing stuff is being done with DNA sequencing and DNA analysis. It cannot tell you if you are a direct descendant from Harold Godwinson. We don't have Harold Godwinson's DNA. It doesn't work like that.
And there are various other reasons why people might try to do this DNA testing.
Again, the slavery thing, this is what I was talking about. This is what I was saying. That's...
I feel like he's kind of hyper-focused on certain reasons why people would do DNA testing, and while those are big reasons, there's a lot of other stuff. I mean, think about the Holocaust reunions that are happening, like the Holocaust Reunion Project, which takes DNA from Holocaust survivors or their children, and then they use that to help identify those people's biological family, which was lost to them because of the Holocaust. But that's just one specific use example, and it's not just tied to just North America. I feel like I hear that from a lot of Europeans, but then I know tons of Europeans who do DNA testing as well. While a lot of these companies are based in the US and thus have a much larger US-based audience, there's a ton of people all around the world doing this testing. The way he's viewing it, especially, is like mostly North America, when there's a ton of South Americans doing DNA testing themselves, and there's companies within South America that are their own companies. There's Genera, which is not one that most people in the English-speaking world have heard of. And that's often actually what I talk about with a lot of DNA databases, is that the ones we hear about are usually more English-speaking country leaning than necessarily North America. Granted, I think Americans and Canadians probably do make up a large majority of the databases, but a lot of people in the UK, a lot of people in Australia and New Zealand, a lot of people in South Africa, and as well a lot of people in countries fairly closely tied to that, especially like Northwestern European countries. Granted, France has a law that makes it illegal to do a DNA test, but there's still a ton of people that are coming from these sorts of areas that are interested in this type of testing.
Right, there are 3 billion, that's 3,000 a million, 3 American billion base pairs of DNA. And you've got the 4 letters of DNA, right? A, T, G, and C. You've got 3 billion base pairs made into 23 pairs of chromosomes, various typologies. If there are any doctors of genetics watching this, by the way, and you want to jump in and give us a better description of DNA, or just link to the Wikipedia page on DNA in the comments, please do so. As far as I'm led to believe, 90%, 97% of our DNA is kind of support structures and bits and bobs that help the actual DNA to stay where it's supposed to inside your body and your cells and all of that kind of thing. And there are bits that we don't need anymore from evolution. We share 99.9% of our DNA. As humans, every single one of us on the planet shares 99.9% of our DNA. I share 99.9% of my DNA with you. Yes, you, the individual who's just gone, who, me? Yes, you. Out of this 99.9%, what we look at really is kind of 0.1% of that DNA when we're doing the Ancestry DNA analysis, right? We're looking for the gap. We're not looking for what we share. We're looking for what's different. And out of the, checks notes, 3 billion base pairs of DNA, Ancestry DNA testing normally looks at about 700,000 locations within your DNA. So within that 3,000 million, 700,000. And most of these places claim to have a margin of error of sort of between 0.1 and 1%. So they say that they have an accuracy rating of between 99 and 99.9%.
And when it's coming to that margin of error, that's just in reading the DNA pairs. So going through each one of those SNPs, each 700,000, 1% of them are going to be read incorrectly or just not read. So sometimes there's just an issue where they can't get a good reading on a specific SNP, and so there's just no reading there at all. So that's the 1% margin of error, but then it gets even more complicated when you start getting into trying to figure out those population references. They're taking that DNA they're testing, those 700,000 SNPs, and then they're looking at what population reference samples do we have that correlates to this DNA. So when you get 70% English, it's saying 70% of your DNA is correlated to the population reference that we are defining as England. And that group is largely made up of people who just know that their ancestry most recently is English. So some of these studies will ask for your grandparents. So they'll basically look for someone where their grandparents, all 4 of them, were born in a certain area. So if they're looking for people who are English, well, they'll look for people where at least 4 of their grandparents were born in England. But then there's a lot of nuance beyond what your grandparents' lives were, because if their grandparents came from somewhere else and you might not know that, and that's just one part of the many difficulties that comes into play when we're trying to figure out these percentages. But the percentages is what people talk about the most, and unfortunately that's why I talk about it a ton on this channel, and why a lot of people that are within this realm of historical study that relates to DNA in different ways will often deal with it as well.
But even if it is 99.9% accurate, that's still hundreds, if not thousands, of errors that can creep in. And they do creep in because we have we've got dozens of articles and posts all over the internet of people who have sent a sample off to 2 different DNA companies, and they've come back and they've received 2 different sets of results. We have genetically identical people, right? We have identical twins who send samples off and get wildly different results, with one saying that they're like half Irish, a quarter Cherokee, and a quarter Spanish, and the other says that they're like half Southeast Asian and a quarter sub-Saharan African. More on that in a minute.
They're not going to be that far off. The completely different thing is not happening. It is slightly different. And there's a lot of reasons for that beyond the margin of error. Because remember, the margin of error, that 1%, is basically the reading of the DNA. So that's just reading each base pair. Is it an A? Is it a T? Is it a C? Is it a G? What's there? Is it AA? Is it TT? Is it CC? GG? CG? Whatever. But once you've done that reading, then they need to start to do the correlations. So the first thing they have to do is they have to do basically what's known as autophasing. There's probably a more specific vernacular for what they're doing exactly, but the idea of phasing is that when you're looking at your DNA, remember there's base pairs. So at each spot you have an A, a T, a C, or a G, but technically you have two. You have either an AA or an AT or a TT, or maybe you have a CC or CG or a GG. When you're looking at that spot, well, one of those letters came from mom and one of those letters came from dad. So to figure out your connection to other populations, we need to look at a string of SNPs in a row, a string of those specific spots that we're testing. So when they try to phase it, you can actually have it where it's incorrect, and instead of it being a string of DNA that's coming from only one parent, they accidentally are putting together different SNPs from the different parents and making it seem like it's one string. So it basically misreads the DNA. So that's just one piece of it. But then when you start talking about comparing different companies, it gets even more complicated, because the different companies, while they're all largely testing about 700,000 SNPs, they're not all testing the same exact spots. The majority of what they're testing are the same spots, but then each company will have a large amount of DNA that only they are testing, and maybe only one other company's testing it, or maybe none of the other companies are testing it. So if you do a DNA test with one company, they might be testing a part of your DNA that you actually inherited from a very distant, very unique ancestry compared to your typical ancestry. So let's say I had an African ancestor and I test on Ancestry, and it just so happens that the unique SNPs they're testing are the SNPs where my African DNA was inherited. But then I tested 23andMe and they aren't testing those unique SNPs. They're testing all of my DNA that has no inheritance from my African ancestry. Well, it's not going to pick up on African. The other one is. So that's another big part of why they're different. But even more, these companies are defining things differently, and they're not all using the same studies. So you will see that some companies will just have a English, Irish, Scottish reading as one big reading itself. So you get English, Irish, Scottish, 33%. But then you test on another company and they have English separated out as its own percentage, Irish separated out as its own percentage, etc. And it gets really complicated in how they are trying to define the population. So there's a lot of stuff going on in terms of why these companies are giving you slightly different readings. Now, in terms of a completely different reading where you have identical twins testing and then one's getting Southeast Asian and Native American and the other one's only getting Sub-Saharan African or something, like what he was saying, like that does not happen. If you look and watch at those videos where they try to do that, oh, we show how wrong these tests are. Well, you look at it and it's like, well, actually it makes a lot of sense, because this one company is saying this percentage English, Irish, Scottish, and then you look at the other company and it's like, oh, well, they have English reading, they have a Scottish reading as its own thing, and then look, they even define Welsh, and then there's a Finnish reading, and like things where it's like, okay, well, it wasn't exactly what the other one said, but when you look at it, the populations make sense in how they correlate. But whenever you hear the stories about adoptees identifying their biological families or cold cases being solved using genetic genealogy, it's the DNA matches that allow us to do that. The admixture is like the first step of, okay, what am I probably going to expect when I dive into the DNA matches? Like, what population groups might I see? Where might I expect them to come from? And sometimes you can get a general idea of, oh, well, if they have this sort of mixture, it might indicate that they might come from this sort of a population group. But that's all you can really do with the admixture, and then from there, you do the actual research with the genetic genealogy and the matches.
And a quarter French. You know, these margins of error do happen, they do exist. They don't check the full sequence. They don't do a full DNA sequence on you. They check these 700,000 locations, as I understand it.
Yes, they don't do the full sequence if you're not doing a whole genome sequence test. If you do whole genome sequence, it is basically doing the full sequence. There's still that, margin of error, so certain things aren't going to be read. And I think with some of the whole genome sequence companies, they might have it kind of limited where it's not the full 3 billion pairs, but it might be like a little bit less. I'm not sure. It varies between every single company. But in terms of the typical direct-to-consumer tests that people talk about, so Ancestry, 23andMe, MyHeritage, Family Tree DNA, and Living DNA, those 5 are kind of the main 5. They are largely testing about 700,000 SNPs. But there's a lot of other tests throughout the world. One I mentioned before was Genera. I believe now they're testing a lot more SNPs, but I remember when I first found out about them, I think they were only testing like 70,000 SNPs. And then there's also newer DNA testing that's coming out that's only used in forensics. So when I worked as an investigative lead genealogist at DNA Labs International, I was part of the team that brought on a type of testing known as Genealogist, where it's only looking at 10,230 SNPs specifically. And we did that because having fewer SNPs allows us to get actual sequences completed for profiles of DNA that we either have too little DNA or it's too degraded, which if you think about DNA from a crime scene, that's what you're dealing with often is very degraded DNA and very low amounts of it. So having a test that does far fewer SNPs allows us to get a more viable profile, and then we can use that and the technology that they've figured out to compare to these 700,000 SNP profiles. But basically, it can vary depending on what test you're taking, but when it comes to the direct-to-consumer test that most people take, it's about 700,000 SNPs.
And they kind of look into genes, and genes are a possibility, right? A gene is a possibility of something. So you might have the genes that cause blue eyes. But then within that, there are variations of that. You might have the gene that causes red hair, but there are variations of red hair genes. You might have 2 blue eyes causing genes and not have blue eyes because genetics is just mind-blowingly nuanced and complex. Punnett squares, yeah, all of that nonsense.
Yeah.
It's crazy how many factors and how many variables there are that could go wrong. And we haven't even touched on where you come from yet, right? We're nearly 10 minutes in, and we haven't even talked about how you're probably not related to Ragnar Lothbrok. And that is because this is how complex this issue is. This is how complicated genetics and DNA testing is. It's more complicated than you think. Ancestry DNA looks at all of the DNA samples that they have taken. These companies have databases of DNA samples, right? And they look at where people are and they match your DNA to that. And that's where we encounter our problem. Because they don't look at where people were from or what culture they were from.
So he's kind of right, but he's also ignoring the fact that they're utilizing a lot of DNA studies. And with a lot of these companies, not all of them, they release a white paper, which goes really in depth into where this information is coming from, how they're coming up with it, and even better, they'll give you statistical representations of how good each population reading is, which is often given as a precision and a recall number. And this is something I've talked about in a lot of videos where if you get your admixture back and you're not quite sure, why did I get this or why did I not get this? Well, if that company releases a white paper, you can go into the white paper, look at it and see, well, if the precision and recall is really low, that indicates that they're not doing a good job in being able to read that. So kind of harping back to what he's been saying throughout is that it is very, very nuanced. And even though he's doing a pretty decent job in terms of discussing it, he's definitely kind of missing on some of that nuance. But it's largely because there's so much to learn about this that I'm sure he did a ton of research. And even with a ton of research, there's still a lot of parts that he's kind of missing. And even myself, as someone who's been doing genetic genealogy for over a decade now, and it feels like every year there's something new to learn about. And especially when I got into the investigative world, the forensic world, that was a whole different side to learn about because in the genetic genealogy world, our focus is autosomal SNPs. Now, we will focus on short tandem repeats, those STR markers, for Y DNA, but beyond that, we're not really utilizing it. But when you look at the forensic world, they're using autosomal STRs. Now, an STR, short tandem repeat, is not where they're necessarily looking at one specific spot in your genome, but they're looking at a string of DNA markers that are in a specific spot that repeat over and over. So you look at a specific spot and it'll go ACT, 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 ACT. And that's a string of 4, so they would read 4 for that spot. And when you do that sort of testing, you can use that to do first degree comparisons or self comparisons. So first degree comparison is where you're comparing yourself to a child, a sibling, or a parent. So basically, when you look at these STR markers between a first degree relative, there will be matching that will indicate that they are that relation. And then same with self. If you compare your STR markers to your own sample, it will come up the same. And this is why they use it in forensics, because it's something that is very reliable. It's become court admissible. They've accepted that for many, many years, well before genetic genealogy really even started taking off. And I don't know when we're going to get to it, but I remember one of the errors that he kind of says is that, you can only do this to figure out a sibling or a parent or a child or whatever. Well, yeah, if you're talking about autosomal STR, but not when you're talking about autosomal SNP. Autosomal SNP, we can do third and fourth cousins and fifth cousins and really distant stuff and actually see how they're related to us. But not always, but we'll jump into that. So let's continue.
What they do is they look at where people are present day. And those samples that they have in that database are overwhelmingly white European populations. Many, many people in Europe want to look at their backgrounds. Many people in North America want to look into their backgrounds. It's relatively rare, it's comparatively rare, that there are big samples from, for example, Southeast Asia, which is why until very recently, some of these companies would only say 20% Southeast Asia instead of saying Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar. Yeah?
Yeah, I mean, they're limited based on what they have in their database. And all of these companies are constantly trying to go out, do population studies in various areas. But that in of itself is a major difficulty, especially when you're going to areas that have no interest in this. And to them, it's like, why are these people trying to do this? We have no benefit from it. And they don't want to do it. So like with a lot of Native American tribes, they don't want to deal with people using DNA to try to prove tribal membership, and that causes a lot of issues. That has made it so that it is very limited. So the most nuanced information we have is largely European population groups, and even more, I would say that's Western and Northwestern European population groups, because as you start to get into kind of the Baltic states and the Balkans and Eastern Europe, it starts to get a lot more difficult.
It's why a lot of these companies would say 20% sub-Saharan Africa instead of saying 20% Congo, 20% Zimbabwe, because those sample sizes weren't there. And that is another area where mistakes will come in. They will, because that's an inaccuracy. If you don't have the data, you can't make an educated conclusion on it.
And this is another reason why these tests are constantly updating, because they are always trying to improve. And as they get more information, they get more people testing, they get more population studies done, well beyond just the people that are testing in their database, they are going to be able to figure out more. And once they have a better idea, then they will update it.
The DNA samples tell you where people are now. It compares your DNA with present populations of people who have sent that DNA in. And this DNA database is only as old as these programs have been going. They've only been taking DNA samples for, let's be really generous and call it 45 years, right? We don't have a DNA map of medieval Europe. We just don't. We have DNA samples from some remains, but not all of those are viable. You can't always take a DNA sample. It's complex, it's expensive, it's an ethical minefield, depending on where and who you are. So we don't have that. Your ancestor, who is in, let's say you have an ancestor in Glasgow, right? And your ancestor in Glasgow may have been
a Scot. They may have been 1,000 years ago. They may have been Pictish. Yeah, they may have been Brythonic, like me. They may have spoken Old or Middle Welsh 1,000 years ago in Strathclyde, in Ystrad They may have been Scandinavian, living in Ystrad. They may have been Irish. They may have spoken Old Irish in Ystrad, or they may have been a Jute, an Angle, a Saxon, a Northumbrian. They could have been Manx, but we don't know. And we will never know. What your DNA testing will not tell you is whether your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddad who lived in Glasgow participated in Lowland Scottish culture, Highland Scottish culture, Manx, Irish, Welsh. Could have been anything.
Yeah, that's where genealogy comes in, and the DNA can help you in uncovering that through DNA matches, but it obviously gets harder as you go further back because you're only getting so much DNA from each one of your ancestors. And when it really comes down to the DNA tests, the admixture side, as well as the DNA matching, it's really only useful and only giving you an idea of like the past 300 to 400 years or so. Now that can vary because really the better way to think of it is by generations. But one way to think of things is if you look at the fifth great grandparent level, you have 124 fifth great grandparents. So you have 4 grandparents, 8 great grandparents, 16 second greats, 32 third greats, 64 fourth greats, and 128 fifth great grandparents. Well, if you get an even amount of DNA from all 128 fifth great grandparents, that's less than 1% of your DNA that you're getting from each one of those fifth great grandparents. And for someone of my age, and I'm in my 30s, a fifth great grandparent is often someone who was born probably about mid 1700s to maybe the late 1700s. But that's also just assuming that you're getting an even amount of DNA from every single ancestor. When it comes to DNA inheritance, your DNA recombines and it's not perfect. You might only get 23% from one of your grandparents and 27% from the other one, and then a third one you get 22%, and the fourth one you get 28%. And it's uneven, and so as you go further back, there are certain ancestors that are going to be more impactful in the DNA that you've inherited than others. So you might get a bunch of DNA from an ancestor, and then you have a sibling that got almost no DNA from that ancestor. So that's why you often will have people that will do a DNA test and they'll get maybe like a 4 or 5% reading of something, and they'll have a sibling that does the same DNA test and they don't get that reading at all. And that can literally just be because one sibling inherited that DNA and the other one didn't. A lot of people that are focused more on ancient history kind of doing, where they really focus on, it's not going to tell you this about 1,000 years ago and that 1,000 years ago. And like, well, probably not. But if you also look at how many ancestors you had 1,000 years ago, you're looking at thousands, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And it gets way, way more because the number of ancestors you have grows exponentially. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to that, especially in terms of pedigree collapse, where you basically have ancestors that end up repeating. So, if you have cousins that marry, then the shared ancestors they have, well, that's technically a repeating ancestor. So you may have certain ancestors where they are your ancestor in many different ways. And especially when you look 1,000 years back, it gets really complicated.
One of the other things we have to remember is you can inherit 0 DNA from an ancestor. You could inherit 1% DNA from an ancestor. And you could have 0 genes in common with your great-great-great-grandfather. 0. You could have no genes in common with them. You could look absolutely nothing like them. Again, because this is an immensely complicated issue that I don't even fully understand, and you should seek a doctor of genetics to explain this more. Ancestry DNA testing relies, and this is one of the really big pitfalls, on self-assessment lineages. So this involves people like us today who have done a bit of genealogy, tracing their family back, probably making mistakes along the way, getting back 20 generations and saying, I am related directly to Ragnar Lothbrok. Let's just go for it. Or let's say, I'm directly descended from Owain Glyndŵr, right? The famous 15th century Welsh freedom fighter. I am directly a descendant from Owain Glyndŵr, and I have traced my family tree back to Owain Glyndŵr, and I have done my DNA test, and it says that I am 60% Welsh, and I am 20% Irish, and I am 10% Scottish, and I'm 5% English, and I'm 5% Danish. You're probably not. You've probably made some mistakes along the way in your research. The chances are that in the period that you're looking into, nobility have fairly solid birth and deaths of their children listed. The common people, 99% of the population, probably don't.
But that also depends on where you're looking. It depends on what that population did in terms of their record systems. So like the Dutch, amazing records. Lots of great records. The Portuguese and the Spanish, tons of records. But not everywhere. And of course, even within those areas, it's going to vary depending on where you're located. And it's going to depend on what religion you might be a part of and all these various things. Basically, was there some sort of a paper trail that could have been created that would help you in uncovering that ancestry? But of course, there's tons of possibilities of mistakes, and especially a lot of people who are laymen in genealogy who don't really know a lot about it. It's very easy to do those mistakes. And then, of course, as you get further back in time, the reliability does go down. So when it comes to like royal connections, we're often talking about what's known as a gateway ancestor. All of their descendants can trace up to them, or at least a large majority can trace up to this gateway ancestor, and that gateway ancestor is part of the royal noble genealogy, which can then be relied upon much further back. So as an example, in my family, one of my gateway ancestors is Juan Alonso Pimentel, the 5th Duke of Benavente. Now, we know that his grandson is my 8th or 9th great grandfather, this guy David Enriquez Pimentel, and we know that because we have what's known as a carta or something like that, where it's literally the Portuguese court sending a letter to David Enriquez Pimentel's son Isaac, telling him that yes, he can use the coat of arms of the House of Pimentel because he's a proven descendant because his father was a grandson of Juan Alonso Pimentel. Now, we don't know who the interconnecting generation is between Juan Alonso Pimentel and his grandson David. So likely a son of Juan Alonso Pimentel's, who's the father of David, possibly a daughter, but either way, we have a record showing that yes, he is a grandson. Now, can we actually prove this through DNA? We have not done so yet, but we can. And it's not going to be through autosomal DNA testing like we've been talking about largely in this video, but through the Y chromosome DNA testing. Basically, if we find an Enriquez Pimentel descendant who's a present-day living male, so, some guy named something Enriquez Pimentel who is a known descendant of David Enriquez Pimentel, we test his Y chromosome DNA, and then we find someone who's a purely paternal descendant of the House of Pimentel. It could be through one of Juan Alonso Pimentel's known sons. It could be through one of his brother's known sons. It could be through one of his uncle's known sons. All we need to do is have a connection of father up one line and father up the other line until they get to that common Pimentel ancestor, and the Y DNA should show a match if that is true. So when it comes to autosomal DNA testing, that DNA testing of the autosomes, those 22 chromosomes, the first 22 pairs of chromosomes, well, that DNA is only really useful, like I said, 200, 300, maybe 400 years. Once you get further than that with autosomal DNA, it becomes highly unreliable because let's say you even have a DNA match where you both show that, Juan Alonso Pimentel is your ancestor. Well, he was living well before autosomal DNA can tell us, and even if we share DNA, it's possible that that shared DNA we have is not through this Pimentel line. It could be through a whole different line. But when it comes to the Y chromosome, it is the purely paternal line. And this is basically what they did for identifying the remains of Richard III. It wasn't with Y chromosome testing, but instead mitochondrial DNA testing, because mitochondrial DNA is inherited through the mother's line. So while we do have DNA testing that allows us to actually prove these connections that are hundreds of years, thousands of years back, it's only that Y chromosome and the mitochondrial, so it's only very specific lines.
There's a reason archaeologists give their own names to skeletons a lot of the time, and it's because ancient peoples and even medieval peoples regularly simply died. No gravestone, no inscription on the coffin, no inscription on the bones, not written down anywhere, or if it was written down, the text has not survived. The vast majority, and I mean the vast majority of people who have died on this planet are forgotten. We do not know their names, and that is a sobering thing to think. But the majority of your ancestors, and my ancestors, are exactly the same. Before the 18th century and 17th century, maybe if you're lucky. Really difficult. Really, really difficult. And we don't have DNA for those people. They did not spit in a test tube and send it off to a database.
But there are techniques that we can do that, as more and more people do them, we might be able to start identifying the DNA of specific ancestors. And this concept is known as reconstructed genomes. And there's a tool already available on gedmatch.com called the Lazarus tool that allows people to create profiles of their ancestors. And I see this as something that will increase as time goes on. More people are able to DNA test, more people do genetic genealogy, more people do DNA painting, more people are then able to start reconstructing the genomes of already deceased ancestors. And then we could possibly reach a point where we have such strong reconstructed genomes of so many ancestors that we can then start to compare those reconstructed genomes with each other and then reconstruct genomes of even further ancestors. So it is a possibility very far down the road, I think, but it is a possibility that we might start reaching a point of being able to create a genome, even if it's a partial genome, but part of that genome of specific ancestors that lived and died hundreds of years ago. As well, artifact testing is something that's becoming very common for the genetic genealogy community. Artifact testing is literally just taking an artifact, an item, where you think the DNA of one of your ancestors is in it. So usually it's like, an envelope that has a stamp that you're pretty sure great grandma licked and put it on there because she's the one that wrote the letter. Well, that DNA sticks between the envelope and the stamp. They can then get an extraction of that DNA, sequence it, and come up with a DNA profile. And now all of a sudden you have your great grandma's DNA. It's basically what they're doing for ancient samples in a sense. Although with ancient DNA, they're not always doing the same sequencing. They're not always doing autosomal SNP sequencing. Sometimes they're doing autosomal STR sequencing. Sometimes it's mitochondrial. Sometimes it's Y chromosome. And there's also limitations based on how degraded that DNA might be, as well as how much DNA is available, because you need a certain amount of DNA to be able to run a microarray SNP chip. So in present day, a lot of what he's saying is correct in the sense that, yeah, we don't have the DNA of a large amount of people, but I think that as time goes on, we could actually reach that point where we start to have very reliable genome sequences for people that have been deceased for hundreds of years, but it will take a while.
So how can we match our DNA with them? Well, you can't, can you? All you can do is match your DNA with the people who are in that part of the world now. And that is why our friend who said that he is DNA 60% Welsh, okay, well, so 60% of your sample is matched with current Welsh people. That doesn't mean anything. It does not work. It truly does not work. It is very good for things like close family relations. So it's really good for things like if you have a long-lost brother or sister or mother and father, and you want to find out who they are or where they are. It can be really, really good for that if we have that DNA in the database, if that's available, and it can help to narrow that down as well. You can narrow things down really well for close relatives, but as soon as we're further away from close relatives, as I understand it, it is extremely fallible.
Now, this is the part where I think he's slipping up a bit, and I think I know why. So he says here, a father, a mother, a brother, a child, whatever. Well, that's a first-degree relative, and that's exactly the limitations for autosomal STR testing, the short tandem repeats. But we're dealing with autosomal SNP testing when we're talking about these ancestry DNA tests, which that's specifically what he said in the beginning was ancestry DNA tests, so specifically the autosomal SNP tests. And with those, we can reliably find fourth and fifth cousins. Now, the further you get out, the more difficult it becomes, which he does kind of say that. He is correct there, but you can find cousins in these DNA matches, and even if you don't have your parents tested, you might be able to then identify them if you're an adoptee and you only had third cousins as your closest matches. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot to figure that out. That's the whole genetic genealogy world, really. But that's the true power of these tests, where you can find people to then help you uncover ancestry that was hidden. And I've done that so many times in my own family, as well as for many, many other people. When I worked as an investigative genetic genealogist, that's the exact process we did to identify unknown human remains and identify perpetrators of violent crimes. And it was the same exact type of work I did when I was doing unknown parentage cases. So helping people that were adoptees or people that had a unknown father or a grandparent that they didn't know. If you go to my main channel, one of my more recent videos was me having Max Miller and his family do DNA tests because their grandfather, Max's grandfather, was adopted and they wanted to find out his biological parents. I did that and was able to figure it out. And it was all distant cousins that were the matches that allowed me to help do that. But it also had to use the paper trail. So it's not just DNA by itself. It's you have to have your DNA, you have to have matches to compare your DNA against, and then you have to have paper trail to then match along with that. So it is a very complicated process, but I think that's why in this spot he might be getting it wrong, because he may have been reading things more about autosomal STR testing, where that limitation of a first degree relative is very strong.
Especially when it's based off self-assessment lineages. So many people now go on Ancestry websites and use census data to trace their families back. And having done it professionally, as a commissioned job, it is tougher than many people think. And it's real easy to make some mistakes here and there. So whenever I get people in the comments who say things like, hey, I am a direct descendant of the third king of Denmark, I'm like, you're not.
See, that's not a good reaction to say you're not, because you know people can make mistakes. Some people do have these lineages proven, especially if you have a good gateway ancestor, that you have a very strong paper trail up to that gateway ancestor. And once you have a gateway ancestor, then you can trace far back, like to Charlemagne. Like, yeah, if you have a fourth or fifth great grandparent where you can confidently trace back to them, and then all of a sudden you see that their parent, this sixth great grandparent was a noble, and they're connected into the well-established royal family trees. Yes, there's that confidence. It's kind of funny because it's like he's like overly skeptical in that sense. Now, I will say that I have run into so many people that will say things like that, and then if you ask them to back it up, they really don't have anything to truly back it up. It was just a very simple, well, I saw it on this site, or, I saw this thing, or maybe they did incorrect genealogy. But to always assume that they're wrong, I think that's a bad take in of itself.
You are statistically not. Like, we all have shared ancestors and we all have common ancestors, but in the way you think, in that direct descent way, statistically, you're not. And you share basically no DNA with them, and also all of your DNA with them.
But when we're talking about DNA and then paper trail things, it's not always going to correlate. So he's talking about DNA tests, but he's also talking about people saying that they have lineages traced very, very far back on specific lines. And a lot of those people aren't using DNA necessarily.
Why you see stuff like, I'm from Iowa and I'm from a Polish family and I'm 1% Chinese, right? Because you may share some genetic markers in common with somebody from China, because there are billions of us, and that's just how statistical probabilities work.
Now, that's a weird statement, because when it comes to the autosomal SNP tests and doing the admixtures, the percentages, the confidence is extremely high when we're talking about things continentally. So if somebody has a European ancestry and then ends up with 1% Chinese in their reading, that's something that stands out. Now, could it be incorrect? Yes, it's within that margin of error percentage of about 1%. It's what we often call a trace result, basically meaning that the confidence is lower than our other results in thinking that it's true. But when we're looking at it continentally, the confidence goes up. And that's kind of the way to read a lot of these admixtures is it's a slider of confidence. And some of these companies even have the confidence slider so you can get an idea of, as you get more confident, what are they more confident about? But basically, you get something that's very different continentally, like having a European ancestry and then 1% Chinese. That could actually represent an actual Chinese ancestor. And you can even figure out about how far back is that ancestor. Well, you get 50% of your DNA from your parents, about 25% from your grandparents, 12.5% from your greats, 6.25% from your second greats, 3 point whatever percent from your third grades, and then it keeps having. So if you have about 1% Chinese amongst an all European ancestry, then if that is actually representing an actual Chinese ancestor, which it could be, that ancestor would have been someone who would have been about maybe a 4th, 5th, 6th great grandparent, possibly even further. So that gives you an idea of how far back in your family tree to trace that. And even more, you can do other things to help you understand what the likelihood is of it and where in that family tree it might be. So maybe you look at a bunch of your DNA cousins, like let's say you have a bunch of your second cousins you've tested on a bunch of different sides, and you notice that this specific set of second cousins that are coming from your father's parents, they're also getting these 1% Chinese readings amongst their all European ancestry. Well, that's telling you that that seems to be where that Chinese ancestry may be coming from. And so now that's where the genealogy comes in. You start tracing that family tree back and trying to see, can you discover that? And this was something that I did for Steve Heimler of Heimler's History, where I took his DNA test results and he only knew of European ancestry, but then happened to have this like 12% Jewish reading. Well, that stood out greatly, and 12% is about a great-grandparent, so I looked at all 8 of his great-grandparents, and wouldn't you know, I was able to identify one of them as Jewish. That started with reading the admixture, so there is a genealogical usefulness to the admixture, and it's in that part, really, of what is the thing that stands out amongst what you know or what makes sense necessarily.
So I'm trying to explain a subject that is so difficult and nuanced and complex that I cannot fit it all on the back of a blood donations envelope, right? I am trying to tell people to do a bit more research here, because some of these companies may be using your DNA for nefarious purposes, they may be trying to scam you, and there are things with the genetic testing for diseases that they don't necessarily tell you, like lifestyle choices can make a difference in whether you get Alzheimer's or not.
Actually, a lot of the DNA tests that do the medical side of things have a ton of different things that they make you click through and consent and all of that because of people thinking that, if it says that I have a high risk of this, I must have this, or it says low risk of this, I must not have it. But they actually will say for a lot of these, understand that this is just the testing of this and that there's other things that are part of it. And, but a lot of people will click through that stuff really quickly, kind of like, when you click, I accept the terms of service and privacy whatevers and all of that. People aren't going to read through all of that. They just click through it. And so people do that, a lot of that with even a lot of the warnings that these sites give. And even a lot of these sites, before you opt into DNA matching, they'll give you warnings of this means that people that match you on your DNA are going to be able to see the information that you have in your profile.
Yes, you can pass things on to your children, but you can also prevent them happening to yourself. Sometimes. Yes, you share DNA with people in Scotland or England, but it's pretty much impossible genetically and from DNA to tell if somebody is English or Irish. From the DNA testing, it is almost impossible. I've asked a couple of geneticists this as part of researching this video, and I was saying, can you tell if somebody is Irish or English from their DNA? And they were like, no, what? We're just a generic Northwestern Europe. Like this tiny little island group in the sea in Northwestern Europe.
And that's definitely making sense coming from a geneticist point of view. And I find this when it comes to talking to people throughout the DNA world, because DNA is something utilized by so many people. And when it comes to genetic genealogy, this has been something that has largely been brought upon by what's called citizen scientists. So a lot of the PhD DNA people and all of the geneticists and all these people that, that's been their careers and they're the experts on things for a long, long time said what we can do with genetic genealogy and DNA testing. No, you can't do that. That's not possible. But they were able to do that. Now, are they perfect? No. But to say that it's not able at all to get a general idea of what population groups within a larger population you might be coming from, that is kind of, I think, a little narrow thinking when it comes to this type of stuff. But it also kind of explains some of his thinking that he said before that I kind of disagreed with, especially in terms of what you're able to do in terms of finding matches that are a certain distance of DNA, because he was talking about first-degree relatives and it's much further than that. But a lot of that makes sense if he's getting a lot of information from geneticists or people dealing more with ancient DNA comparisons and things like that. Probably would have been really good for him to have consulted a genetic genealogist as well.
It's not all it's cracked up to be. Yet, we may reach a point where it becomes really incredibly good, but it's not a time machine. It's not a time machine, and it's not a crystal ball. We don't have a DNA database from 1,000 years ago. So if you say that the DNA testing says that you're descended from a medieval king of Denmark, I'm sorry, but you're not. It really, really doesn't, because it cannot, because we don't have their DNA. We don't have 1,000 years of DNA to prove that. Sorry. But yeah, I went off on a bit of a rabbit hole there, didn't I? So I hope that was a bit of educational content for you. It's a lot, isn't it? This genetics, this DNA stuff.
So this was a super, super long reaction. I don't know how long the edit's going to be, but I have been doing this reaction for almost 2 hours for a almost 25-minute video, or I guess just a little over a 25-minute video. And I would say it was decent. You can tell he did a lot of research, but I think he bit off a little more than he could chew for this video. A little too much on his plate. It really comes back to what he said in the beginning, where there is a lot of nuance to it. There's a lot to know. And even within the DNA world, there is so much going on that people working in the different parts of it are kind of blind to other parts. It's kind of like that poem, The Three Blind Men and the Elephant. 3 blind men are standing in an elephant. One's at the trunk, one's at the leg, and one's at the tail. Well, the guy at the trunk is defining how the trunk feels. And the one at the leg's like, that's not what this feels like. And they're feeling the leg and describing it. And the others are like, no. And the one at the tail is like, well, no, it feels like this. And well, they're all right. They're all correct, because yes, they are all feeling the elephant, but they only have a part of that information. And the DNA world feels a lot like that. The forensic scientists, the DNA analysts, the serologists that I worked with in the forensic world, there was a lot they had to learn. There was a lot I had to learn when I joined the forensic world. And then there's this side of the DNA world known as phenotyping, where they're doing something similar to the medical stuff, but instead they're trying to determine what do you look like? What are your eye color? What's your hair color? What's your skin color, etc.? Then there's the ancient DNA side of things, and then there's probably a lot of other sides of it, and they're all using DNA, but they're looking at it in very different ways, and they're analyzing it in very different ways. So overall, I think he makes a lot of good points, but at the same time, he definitely kind of misses the mark on a couple of things. And if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see another reaction just like it, be sure to check out this video of mine right here. Thank you to my Patreon patrons and YouTube members.